Francis of Assisi, the saint who gave everything to embrace the forgotten. In a world fractured by pride, greed, and violence, a man once walked barefoot through the towns of Umbria, dressed in the roughest cloth, with nothing but love in his heart and peace in his voice. He came not with power, but with poetry. Not with gold, but with grace. Not to rule men, but to remind them of their Creator in the simplicity of nature, in the suffering of the poor, in the silence of prayer. That man was Giovanni di Pietro di Bernard, known forevermore as Francis of Assisi. Born into privilege around the year 1181 in Assisi, Italy, Francis could have chosen comfort. He could have inherited his father's wealth and status as a wealthy cloth merchant. But something more profound called him. Something deeper than coin or castle, the suffering Christ. And so he stripped himself, literally, of everything, even the clothes on his back, to embrace a life of radical poverty and divine purpose. Saint Francis was not simply a religious figure. He was a revolution clothed in humility. A mystic who spoke to animals, embraced lepers, preached to birds, and crossed enemy lines during the Crusades to speak of peace. He was a living contradiction to the might and materialism of his time. And yet his message, simple and wild as the wind, endures. In 1209, he founded the Order of Friars Minor, the Franciscans, rooted in living the gospel as purely as possible. He walked across medieval Europe as a beggar, not out of weakness, but as a conscious rebellion against the growing arrogance of the church and the kings alike. When war was waged in God's name, he dared to walk alone into the heart of the Islamic world, into the tent of Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt, not to conquer but to connect, not to preach superiority but to offer peace. In 1224, while in deep prayer and ecstasy, Francis received the stigmata, the marks of Christ's crucifixion, on his own body. It was the first recorded case in Christian history and solidified his spiritual kinship with Jesus. 2 years later, broken in body but overflowing with spirit, he died on October 3, 1226, singing psalms as his soul returned to the God he had followed so radically. Canonized in 1228, only 2 years after his death, Francis of Assisi remains one of Christianity's most beloved and universally admired saints. Patron of animals, the environment, Italy, and those who seek peace, his feast day on October 4th is marked by blessings of creatures great and small, a legacy of his deep reverence for all living things. It is no coincidence that World Animal Day falls on the same date. And for those seeking a sign that holiness can still walk among us in simplicity, humility, and joy, they need only look to Assisi, or into the eyes of a stray dog, a whisper of wind through the trees, a beggar's hand reaching out in faith. In all these things, the spirit of Francis lives on. Certainly. Here's a more professional and refined version of the passage. Francis of Assisi, Italian, Francesco d'Assisi, Latin, Franciscus Assisiensis, was originally baptized Giovanni by his mother. His full name, Giovanni di Pietro di Bernard, reflects his paternal lineage, with his father being Pietro di Bernard, a wealthy merchant. At the time of Francis' birth in the small Italian town of Assisi, Pietro was away on a business trip in France. Upon his return, he began referring to his son as Francesco, meaning the Frenchman or free man, likely in homage to his own commercial success in France and his admiration for French culture. Early life and spiritual awakening of Francis of Assisi. Francis of Assisi was born around the year 1181, the son of Pietro di Bernard de Morricone, a prosperous Italian silk merchant, and Pica di Burlmont, a noblewoman originally from Provence, France. While little is known about Pica beyond her aristocratic origins, her influence, alongside Pietro's commercial success, shaped Francis' early life in privilege and refinement. Baptized Giovanni by his mother, the child was later nicknamed Francesco by his father upon returning from a business trip to France, possibly in tribute to his thriving trade in the region or his personal admiration for French culture. From an early age, Francis lived a life of comfort, indulgence, and social prestige. He was known for his charm, wit, and gallant demeanor, often dressing in fine clothes and spending lavishly. He admired troubadours, reveled in poetry, and was deeply drawn to the elegance and romanticism of Transalpine Europe. Despite this carefree lifestyle, signs of Francis's inner transformation began to surface early. One widely recounted episode, the story of the beggar, illustrates his growing discomfort with materialism. While selling cloth on behalf of his father in the town marketplace, Francis encountered a poor man asking for alms. After completing his transaction, Francis pursued the beggar and gave him everything he had. His friends mocked his gesture, and his father reacted with anger. Nevertheless, this act marked the beginning of a profound moral and spiritual awakening. Around 1202, Francis joined a military expedition against Perugia, during which he was captured and imprisoned in Calistrata. He spent nearly a year in captivity, during which illness and reflection led him to question his life's direction. Although he resumed his former lifestyle upon returning to Assisi in 1203, a deeper change had begun. In 1205, he set out to enlist in the army of Walter III, Count of Brienne, but a mysterious vision compelled him to abandon his plans and return to Assisi, more detached from worldly pursuits. When asked by a friend whether he intended to marry, Francis responded enigmatically, "Yes, a nobler bride than any you have seen," referring to his spiritual union with Lady Poverty. While on a pilgrimage to Rome, Francis chose to experience the life of the destitute firsthand, begging alongside the poor outside St. Peter's Basilica. He soon began to retreat into solitude, seeking divine guidance. In a moment of deep prayer at the dilapidated chapel of San Damiano near Assisi, he experienced a mystical vision. As he gazed upon the crucified Christ, Francis heard a voice saying, "Francis, Francis, go and repair my church, which, as you can see, is falling into ruins." Interpreting this literally, Francis took cloth from his father's store, sold it, and attempted to donate the proceeds to the chapel's priest. When the priest refused the money due to its questionable origins, Francis threw the coins on the ground in defiance. Fearing his father's wrath, Francis hid for a month in a cave near San Damiano. When he emerged, filthy, disheveled, and emaciated, he was publicly humiliated, beaten, and imprisoned by his father. Freed by his mother in Pietro's absence, Francis returned to San Damiano and sought refuge with the priest. However, Pietro soon brought legal action against his son, demanding the return of his money and a formal renunciation of his inheritance. In a dramatic scene before the Bishop of Assisi, Francis publicly rejected his patrimony, stripping himself naked to symbolize his break from worldly attachments. The bishop, moved by the gesture, covered him with his own cloak. For several months thereafter, Francis lived as a beggar, wandering the hills near Assisi. He took refuge in a nearby monastery, working as a scullion, and later found brief respite in Gubbio, where a friend provided him with the cloak, belt, and staff of a pilgrim. Returning to Assisi, he wandered the streets begging for stones to rebuild the chapel of San Damiano. With his own hands, he began to reconstruct it, and over time restored other ruined chapels in the region, including San Pietro in Spina near San Petrignano and the Porziuncola, the humble chapel of St. Mary of the Angels, nestled in the plain beneath Assisi. The Porziuncola would become Francis's most beloved sanctuary and the spiritual heart of the Franciscan movement. During this period of transformation, Francis also began to care for lepers, tending to their needs in the isolated colonies outside the city. This intimate service to society's most marginalized became central to his evolving vocation and set the foundation for a life defined by humility, compassion, and devotion to the suffering Christ. The founding of the Franciscan order. In February 1208, while attending Mass at the chapel of Santa Maria degli Angeli, St. Mary of the Angels, located near the humble hut he had constructed for himself, Francis of Assisi experienced a profound spiritual awakening. The gospel reading that day was from the book of Matthew, the Commissioning of the 12, in which Jesus instructs his disciples to go forth and proclaim that the kingdom of God is at hand. Deeply moved, Francis interpreted this as a personal calling to live in absolute poverty and preach repentance and peace. In response, Francis adopted the simple attire of the poorest Umbrian peasants, a coarse woolen tunic tied at the waist with a rope, marked by 3 knots symbolizing poverty, chastity, and obedience. He began to travel through the countryside, exhorting ordinary people to embrace a life of penance, compassion, and brotherly love. Notably, Francis preached without ecclesiastical authorization, an uncommon and bold move at the time, especially for a layperson. His authenticity and fervor quickly attracted followers. Within a year, Francis was joined by 11 companions who shared his vision of a humble, Christ-centered life. The group initially took up residence in the abandoned leper colony of Rivo Tordo near Assisi, living in extreme simplicity. They spent much of their time walking through the rugged terrain of Umbria, relying on the kindness of strangers and offering words of faith and consolation. Their sincerity left a strong impression on those they encountered. In 1209, Francis composed a simple rule of life for his followers, known as the Regula Primitiva or Primitive Rule, which drew directly from passages in the Bible. Its central tenet was to follow the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ and to walk in his footsteps. With this guiding principle, Francis and his 11 companions journeyed to Rome to seek formal recognition of their way of life. Upon arriving in Rome, the group encountered Bishop Guido of Assisi, who introduced them to Cardinal Giovanni di San Paolo, the Cardinal Bishop of Sabina and personal confessor to Pope Innocent III. The cardinal was deeply sympathetic to Francis and agreed to present his case to the Holy Father. Though some papal advisors were skeptical, fearing that Francis's radical embrace of poverty was both impractical and potentially subversive, Pope Innocent III experienced a vision in which he saw Francis supporting the crumbling Lateran Basilica, the symbolic center of the Church. Interpreting this as a divine sign, the Pope gave his informal approval. Tradition holds that on April 16, 1210, Pope Innocent III officially authorized the foundation of the order, allowing Francis and his followers to continue their mission under the Church's protection. The friars were tonsured, formally marking their consecration to religious life, and the newly recognized community became known as the Ordo Fratrum Minorum, Order of Lesser Brothers, more commonly referred to as the Order of Friars Minor, or simply the Franciscans. Headquartered at the Porziuncola, the small chapel that had become Francis's spiritual home, the friars began their work in Umbria and soon expanded their preaching throughout Italy. Though Francis was never ordained a priest, he was later ordained as a deacon, allowing him to preach officially within the Church. The founding of the Franciscan order marked the beginning of a transformative movement that would leave a profound and lasting impact on Christianity, emphasizing humility, simplicity, and unwavering devotion to the gospel. The foundation of the Poor Clares and the Third Order. Following the official establishment of the Franciscan order, the movement inspired a rapidly growing number of followers, including individuals from all walks of life who were drawn to the simplicity, humility, and spiritual depth of Francis's vision. Among those moved by his preaching was a young noblewoman of Assisi, Clare of Faverone di Affroduccio, later known as Saint Clare of Assisi. In 1211, after hearing Francis preach at the Church of San Rufino, Clare resolved to dedicate her life to the same ideals of poverty and service. On the night of Palm Sunday, March 28, 1212, she left her family home in secret and made her way to the Porziuncola, where Francis received her into religious life. He clothed her in a simple habit modeled after his own and temporarily placed her, along with her younger sister Caterina, later known as Agnes of Assisi, and a few other women, in a nearby Benedictine monastery for their safety. Once a more permanent arrangement could be secured, Francis relocated the group to San Damiano, a modest complex of huts and cells outside Assisi. There, they embraced a cloistered life of prayer, austerity, and absolute poverty. This community marked the founding of the Second Franciscan Order, formerly known as the Order of Poor Ladies and later recognized as the Poor Clares. The order flourished under Clare's leadership and remains active worldwide to this day, upholding the Franciscan ideals in a monastic setting. Recognizing that many individuals were inspired by the Franciscan message, but unable to leave their homes or secular responsibilities, Francis established a third branch of his movement, the Third Order of Brothers and Sisters of Penance. This fraternity was open to both laypeople and clergy who wished to live according to Franciscan principles without taking formal religious vows or withdrawing from society. Members of the Third Order embraced a life of prayer, charity, and simplicity within their everyday environments, whether as merchants, artisans, farmers, or nobility, committing themselves to spiritual growth and social justice. The rule Francis gave them provided a framework for integrating gospel values into secular life, making the Franciscan charism accessible to a broader community. Over time, the Third Order, now formally known as the Secular Franciscan Order, expanded far beyond Italy, forming an international network of lay fraternities committed to living the gospel in the world. Together, the First Order, Friars Minor, Second Order, Poor Clares, and Third Order represent the enduring spiritual legacy of Francis of Assisi, offering diverse paths to holiness rooted in humility, fraternity, and peace. Francis of Assisi in Spain and the legacy of the Medrano family. Driven by an unwavering desire to spread the gospel to all peoples and allow divine grace to touch every heart, Saint Francis of Assisi made several attempts to carry his message beyond the borders of Italy. One notable early mission is believed to have taken place around 1211, when Francis traveled through the region of La Rioja in northern Spain. At that time, the castle and town of Agoncillo, near the city of Legrano, were under the lordship of the Medrano family, a noble house of local prominence. According to regional tradition, the son of the Medrano lord was gravely ill with a mysterious and incurable disease. During his journey through Agoncillo, Francis visited the Medrano castle, where he laid his hands upon the boy and miraculously restored him to health. This act not only secured the Medrano lineage, but also cemented a spiritual bond between the saint and the family that would endure for centuries. In gratitude, the Medrano family generously donated land near the Ebro River within the city of Legrano, including a tower, to Saint Francis. There, he established the first Franciscan convent in Spain. The site would become a vital center for Franciscan spirituality and remain closely associated with the Medrano family for generations. By the late 14th century, Diego López de Medrano, then Lord of Agoncillo and a high-ranking royal steward and ambassador to King John I of Castile, formally established a hereditary chaplaincy in the principal chapel of the monastery of San Francisco in Legrano. This act institutionalized the family's patronage over the site and reflected their enduring devotion to the legacy of Saint Francis. The monastery served not only as a center of worship, but also as the dynastic burial ground for the Medrano family, reinforcing their spiritual and social prestige. Throughout its history, the convent of San Francisco in Legrano benefited from royal protection and held considerable ecclesiastical and civic privileges. It was exempt from municipal taxation, maintained autonomous jurisdiction over its lands and dependencies, and enjoyed close relations with the Castilian monarchy. These privileges underscored the convent's importance in both the religious and political fabric of the region. The Medrano family, reinforcing their spiritual and social prestige. Throughout its history, the convent of San Francisco in Legrano benefited from royal protection and held considerable ecclesiastical and civic privileges. It was exempt from municipal taxation, maintained autonomous jurisdiction over its lands and dependencies, and enjoyed close relations with the Castilian monarchy. These privileges underscored the convent's importance in both the religious and political fabric of the region. On March 29, 1537, Maundy Thursday, the Cofradía de la Santa Vera Cruz, one of the oldest religious confraternities in La Rioja, was established within the convent. According to documents preserved in the Diocesan Historical Archive, the confraternity had its own chapel inside the monastery. The guardian superior of the Franciscan community served as its chaplain, and the friars themselves were considered integral members of the brotherhood. Although the convent of San Francisco was ultimately dissolved in the 19th century, remnants of its structure still stand as a testament to its historical and spiritual significance. Under the enduring patronage of the House of Medrano, the convent played a central role in the spread of Franciscan ideals in Spain, serving as a powerful symbol of faith, healing, and noble devotion. Missionary journey during the Fifth Crusade. In the spring of 1212, Saint Francis of Assisi set out on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, driven by a deep desire to bring the message of the gospel to all peoples. However, his voyage was abruptly interrupted when a storm caused his ship to wreck along the Dalmatian coast, forcing him to return to Italy. Despite this setback, Francis's missionary spirit remained undeterred. On May 8, 1213, Francis received the mountain of La Verna, Alverna, as a gift from Count Orlando di Chiusi. The Count described the location as eminently suitable for anyone wishing to do penance in a place remote from mankind. La Verna would become one of Francis's most cherished retreats, offering solitude for prayer, contemplation, and later serving as the site where he received the stigmata. In 1219, during the Fifth Crusade, Francis undertook a bold mission to Egypt, where Christian forces had been entrenched for over a year in a prolonged siege of the Muslim-held city of Damietta. Accompanied by Friar Illuminatus of Arce, Francis sought to carry out an extraordinary act of faith, to convert the Sultan of Egypt or become a martyr for Christ. The Sultan at the time, Al-Malik al-Kamil, nephew of the legendary Saladin, had assumed power in 1218 and was stationed upstream of Damietta. On August 29, 1219, the Crusaders launched a bloody and ultimately fruitless assault on the city, after which both sides agreed to a temporary 4-week truce. It was likely during this ceasefire that Francis and Illuminatus crossed enemy lines and entered the Muslim camp. Historical accounts, while sparse in detail, agree that Francis was received graciously by the Sultan and remained in his camp for several days. Although the content of their conversations is not documented in contemporary sources, it is widely accepted that Francis preached the gospel message during his stay. Remarkably, Francis returned to the Crusader encampment unharmed, a testament, perhaps, to the respect he commanded through his humility, courage, and peaceful approach. While no contemporary Arab sources mention the encounter, later Christian accounts, including a 1267 sermon by Saint Bonaventure, suggest that the Sultan was deeply moved by Francis, with some legends even claiming he converted in secret or received baptism on his deathbed. However, such assertions remain unverified and belong to the realm of hagiographical tradition rather than historical certainty. Following this mission, Francis and his companion departed for Acre and returned to Italy in the latter half of 1220. Despite the lack of definitive outcomes from his encounter with Al-Kamil, the legacy of Francis's peaceful approach to interfaith dialogue endured. One lasting result of this mission was the establishment of a permanent Franciscan presence in the Holy Land. As early as 1217, the Franciscans founded the custody of the Holy Land, a mission that has endured with minimal interruption to the present day. In 1333, the Mamluk Sultan granted the Franciscans custodial rights over several Christian holy sites in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. These rights were later affirmed and expanded by Pope Clement VI in 1342, granting the Franciscans jurisdictional privileges in the name of the Catholic Church. Francis's bold witness during the Fifth Crusade remains one of the most powerful examples in Christian history of evangelization through peace, dialogue, and personal sacrifice rather than violence, a testament to his enduring legacy as a bridge builder across faiths and cultures. Reorganization and formalization of the Franciscan Order. As the Franciscan movement rapidly expanded, its growing body of followers posed new challenges to the simple, informal structure on which the order had been founded. The friars were soon organized into provinces, and missions were dispatched across Europe, including to France, Germany, Hungary, Spain, and even as far east as the Holy Land. Informed of the martyrdom of 5 friars in Morocco, Francis returned to Italy via Venice, deeply affected by their sacrifice. Around the same time, Cardinal Ugolino di Conti, later Pope Gregory IX, was appointed by the papacy as the official protector of the Franciscan order, providing much-needed ecclesiastical oversight during a critical period of growth. One of the primary reasons for Francis's return was the urgent need to address the organizational deficiencies of the order. The astonishing rate of expansion had far outpaced the primitive structures and informal governance that had initially guided the fraternity, which until then relied largely on Francis's personal example and a brief, loosely defined rule of life. To provide more clarity and structure, Francis composed a new and more comprehensive guideline in 1221, known as the First Rule or the Rule without a Papal Bull, Regula Prima, Regula non bullata. While remaining steadfast in its emphasis on evangelical poverty and apostolic simplicity, the rule introduced more detailed instructions for the daily life and governance of the friars. However, this version was never formally ratified by the Pope. Following the death of Brother Peter, who had served as vicar in Francis's absence, leadership of the order passed to Brother Elias of Cortona. Under Elias's more pragmatic administration, and with Francis's guidance, the rule was further revised to meet the practical needs of the growing fraternity. In 1223, Francis composed a final, more concise version of the rule, known as the Second Rule or the Rule with a Bull, Regula Bullata. It was officially approved by Pope Honorius III on November 29, 1223, thereby becoming the binding constitution of the Franciscan order. This rule called the friars to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, living in obedience, without anything of their own, and in chastity. It also included formal regulations regarding preaching, discipline, admission into the order, and internal governance. With the rule now sanctioned by papal authority, Francis gradually withdrew from the administrative affairs of the order. In the years that followed, particularly in 1221 and 1222, he traveled extensively throughout Italy, journeying as far south as Catania in Sicily and as far north as Bologna, preaching the gospel and encouraging the friars to remain faithful to the original spirit of humility, poverty, and joyful service that had defined their beginnings. Stigmata, Final Days, and Canonization of Saint Francis of Assisi. In the autumn of 1224, during a 40-day fast in preparation for the Feast of Michaelmas, September 29th, Saint Francis of Assisi retreated to the remote mountain of La Verna for solitude and prayer. On September 17th, 3 days after the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, Francis experienced a profound mystical vision, one that would become central to his sanctity and legacy. According to Brother Leo, who was present at La Verna, Francis saw a vision of a seraph, a six-winged angel crucified in the likeness of Christ. During this ecstatic encounter, Francis is said to have received the stigmata, the 5 sacred wounds of Christ, becoming the first recorded individual in Christian history to bear them. Brother Leo later provided a detailed and solemn account of the event, marking it as the earliest documented case of stigmata in Western Christianity. Following this event, Francis's health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from trachoma, a painful eye disease likely contracted during his time in Egypt, and the wounds of the stigmata compounded his physical suffering. Despite receiving medical care in Siena, Cortona, and Nocera, his condition worsened. Eventually, the Bishop of Ostia ordered an excruciating procedure to cauterize Francis's eyes with heated irons in a desperate attempt to treat his blindness. Francis, however, reportedly felt no pain, a detail recounted with awe by his followers. As his end approached, Francis was brought back to a small hut near the Porziuncola, his beloved chapel outside Assisi. There, he dictated his final spiritual testament, words of deep humility and encouragement for his brothers to live the gospel with unwavering faith. On the evening of Saturday, October 3rd, 1226, Francis passed away peacefully while chanting Psalm 141, Voce mea ad Dominum clamavi, with my voice I cry out to the Lord. Less than 2 years later, on July 16th, 1228, Pope Gregory IX, formerly Cardinal Ugolino di Conti, a close friend and protector of the Franciscan order, canonized Francis as a saint in a solemn ceremony. The following day, the Pope laid the foundation stone for the Basilica of Saint Francis in Assisi, which would become a major center of pilgrimage. Saint Francis was buried on May 25th, 1230 beneath the lower basilica. However, due to fears of theft or desecration during the threat of Saracen incursions, Brother Elias, then Minister General of the Order, secretly concealed the location of the saint's tomb. The exact burial site remained hidden for nearly 6 centuries until its rediscovery in 1818. Architect Pasquale Belli constructed a crypt within the lower basilica to house the saint's remains, which were further restored and restructured by Ugo Tarchi between 1927 and 1930. In 1978, a scholarly commission appointed by Pope Paul VI examined and authenticated the relics. The remains were subsequently enshrined in a glass urn within the ancient stone tomb, where they remain today for public veneration. In 1935, medical historian Dr. Edward Frederick Hartung concluded that Francis had contracted trachoma during his missionary journey to Egypt and ultimately died of quartan malaria. His findings were published in the Annals of Medical History, offering a modern perspective on the saint's physical ailments and final illness. The sanctity of Francis of Assisi, marked by his mystical experiences, suffering, and unwavering commitment to Christ, has made him one of the most beloved and venerated figures in Christian history. His life continues to inspire countless faithful around the world. Francis of Assisi sought to emulate Christ closely, dedicating himself to carrying out Christ's work in a literal sense. This commitment is fundamental to understanding Francis' character, his profound devotion to the Eucharist, and his deep respect for the priests who administer the sacrament. Francis famously preached, "Your God is of your flesh. He lives in your nearest neighbor, in every man." Central to Francis' spirituality was the celebration and veneration of poverty. This principle was so integral to his identity that in his final written testament, he emphasized that absolute personal and communal poverty was essential for members of his order. Francis regarded nature as a reflection of God's presence. He affectionately referred to all creatures as his brothers and sisters, preaching even to birds. According to tradition, he famously persuaded a wolf in Gubbio to cease attacking local residents, on the condition that they would provide the wolf with food. His profound sense of divine brotherhood extended to all beings, and he declared that he could not consider himself a true friend of Christ if he did not cherish those for whom Christ died. Francis' journey to Egypt and his efforts toward reconciliation with the Muslim world had enduring repercussions beyond his lifetime. Following the fall of the Crusader kingdom, it was the Franciscans, uniquely among Catholic orders, who were permitted to remain in the Holy Land and were officially recognized as the custodians of the Holy Land on behalf of the Catholic Church. Around 1220, at Greccio near Assisi, Francis introduced the first known nativity scene, Principio or creche, to commemorate Christmas. His approach reflected traditional imagery, but with a unique emphasis on sensory experience. He incorporated live animals to create a vivid and contemplative environment for worshippers to engage directly with the birth of Jesus. Both Thomas of Celano and Bonaventure, early biographers of Francis, describe how he used a simple straw-filled manger position between a live ox and donkey. Thomas noted the scene's beauty in its simplicity, with the manger itself serving as the altar during the Christmas Mass. Contrary to some modern assumptions and portrayals by animal rights advocates, historical evidence indicates that Francis was not a vegetarian. His earliest biographers do not mention any abstention from meat, and records show that he did consume meat. Notably, his favorite dish was reportedly shrimp pie. Francis preached the Christian doctrine that the world, created good and beautiful by God, nonetheless suffers from the effects of human sin, and therefore requires redemption. As one who perceived God reflected in nature, Saint Francis was recognized as a profound lover of God's creation. In his celebrated Canticle of the Sun, he expresses gratitude to God for brother sun, sister moon, brother wind, water, fire, and earth, all of which he regards as praising the Creator. Numerous accounts from Francis' life attest to his deep affection for animals and the natural environment. The Fioretti, Little Flowers, a collection of legends and folklore compiled after his death, includes a story wherein Francis, traveling with companions, encountered a road lined with trees filled with birds. Francis instructed his companions to wait while he preached to my sisters the birds. The birds, captivated by his voice, did not flee but instead gathered around him. He is frequently depicted in art holding a bird, symbolizing this intimate connection. Another well-known legend from the Fioretti describes an episode in Gubbio, where Francis resided for a time. The city was terrorized by a fierce wolf that preyed upon both people and animals. Francis approached the wolf in the hills, made the sign of the cross, and commanded it to cease its attacks. He then brought the wolf before the astonished townspeople and brokered a pact. The wolf, which had caused harm out of hunger, would no longer prey on the community if they agreed to feed it regularly. Through this agreement, Gubbio was freed from the threat of the predator. On November 29, 1979, Pope John Paul II formally declared Francis the patron saint of ecology. In a speech on March 28, 1982, the Pope highlighted Francis' love and stewardship of creation as a challenge for contemporary Catholics, urging them not to behave like dissident predators where nature is concerned, but to assume responsibility for it, taking all care so that everything stays healthy and integrated, so as to offer a welcoming and friendly environment even to those who succeed us. On the occasion of the World Day of Peace in 1990, John Paul II further emphasized that Francis invited all of creation, animals, plants, natural forces, even brother sun and sister moon, to give honor and praise to the Lord. He portrayed Francis as a powerful witness to the idea that peace with God enables a commitment to fostering peace with all creation, which is inseparable from peace among all peoples. In 2015, Pope Francis published his encyclical Laudato Si, addressing the ecological crisis and the need for care for our common home. Taking its title from the Canticle of the Sun composed by Francis of Assisi, the encyclical presents Francis as the exemplary model of compassionate care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology joyfully and authentically lived. This document inspired the establishment of the Laudato Si movement, a global network comprising nearly 1,000 organizations dedicated to promoting the encyclical's message and the Franciscan approach to ecological stewardship. The feast day of Saint Francis of Assisi is observed annually on October 4th. A secondary feast commemorating the reception of the stigmata by Francis was introduced into the general Roman calendar in 1585, subsequent to the Tridentan calendar. This feast was suppressed in 1604, but later restored in 1615. With the promulgation of the new Roman Missal in 1969, the Feast of the Stigmata was once again removed from the general calendar to avoid duplication of the principal feast on October 4th, and it was retained only in the liturgical calendars of certain localities and within the Franciscan order. However, in contexts where the Tridentan Missal remains in use, the Feast of the Stigmata continues to be included in the general calendar. Saint Francis is also commemorated with a lesser festival on October 4th in various Christian traditions, including the Church of England, the Anglican Church of Canada, the Episcopal Church in the United States, the Old Catholic Churches, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, as well as other churches and religious communities. A widespread custom on Francis' feast day is the blessing of animals, during which parishioners bring their pets and other creatures to church to receive a special blessing, reflecting Francis' well-known love for all living beings. On March 13, 2013, following his election as Pope, Archbishop and Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina selected the name Francis in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, thereby becoming Pope Francis. During his first audience with journalists on March 16, 2013, Pope Francis explained that he chose this papal name to signify his commitment to the poor, reflecting the values embodied by Saint Francis of Assisi. He recalled that immediately after his election, Cardinal Claudio Hummes had urged him, "Do not forget the poor," a reminder that inspired Bergoglio to adopt the name. This marked the first occasion in history that a pope chose the name Francis. On June 18, 1939, Pope Pius XII declared Saint Francis of Assisi a joint patron saint of Italy, alongside Saint Catherine of Siena, through the apostolic letter Licet Commissa. Pope Pius XII also referenced both saints in a laudatory discourse delivered on May 5, 1949 at the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Saint Francis is widely recognized as the patron saint of animals and ecology. In this capacity, he serves as the patron of the Laudato Si movement, an international network dedicated to promoting the Franciscan ecological vision as articulated in the encyclical Laudato Si. Additionally, Saint Francis is considered the patron saint invoked against dying alone and against fire. He is also the patron of the Franciscan Order, Catholic Action, Families, Peace, and Needleworkers, among several religious congregations. His patronage extends to numerous churches and localities worldwide, including Italy, San Paul el Bahar, Malta, Freising, Germany, Lancaster, Lancashire, Katapuram, India, Buhi, Cameron Sur, and General Trias in the Philippines, San Francisco, California, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Colorado, Salina, Kansas, Metuchen, New Jersey, and Quibdó, Colombia. The enduring legacy of Saint Francis of Assisi transcends denominational boundaries and continues to inspire diverse religious traditions and spiritual movements worldwide. Within Anglicanism, the revival of religious orders in the 19th century rekindled Franciscan spirituality through communities such as the Society of Saint Francis and the Community of Saint Clare, while the ancient custom of blessing animals on his feast day has spread broadly to Lutheran and other Protestant churches. Protestant groups have also embraced Franciscan teachings, establishing orders dedicated to living out his vision of simplicity, compassion, and care for creation. While Saint Francis is not formally recognized as a saint within the Orthodox churches, his influence is nevertheless felt. Though met with theological caution, his figure appears in Orthodox iconography and is venerated in certain monastic communities, reflecting a shared reverence for his life of humility and devotion. Beyond Christianity, the example of Francis resonates across spiritual boundaries, inspiring figures such as Eckhart Tolle and interfaith communities like Skundau Vale, which model themselves on Franciscan principles of peace, care for creation, and interreligious harmony. Saint Francis' literary contributions, especially his poetry in the vernacular Umbrian dialect, mark him as a pioneer of accessible spirituality and devotion. His Canticle of the Sun remains a timeless hymn of praise for creation, and his spiritual writings continue to challenge and inspire. From the moment of his canonization, Francis' life has been immortalized in art, music, and culture. His story vividly depicted in frescoes, paintings, and countless devotional works that evoke his ecstatic communion with God and creation. Through centuries, Saint Francis remains a symbol of radical love, peace, and ecological stewardship, calling all humanity to a deeper relationship with God, neighbor, and the natural world. In a fractured world marked by division and environmental crisis, the example of Saint Francis stands as a beacon of hope and renewal, urging us to embrace humility, compassion, and responsible guardianship of the earth. His life is not merely history, but a living call to embody mercy, simplicity, and harmony with all creation.